from Legends of Texas, which I think was a Texas Folklore Society publication in 1924.
Wow.
And then J. Frank Dobie told his version of the story. You know, he always said he was more storyteller than folklorist, and that the story belonged to whichever storyteller could tell it best.
Amen.
He wrote his in it was published in 1928. A man named Tommy DiPaolo, who was from New England, told his version of the story and illustrated it in 1983. My version of the story was published in 2005. So here it is. Back in the days when it did not rain, there lived a little Comanche girl who had no name. Or she might have been called she who stays at the edge of things, or she who seldom speaks. And it was just so now that she stood at the edge of the gathering of her people, and she said not a word as she watched the dancers dancing and listened to the drummers drumming as they sent up their cry to the Great Spirit to know what they must do to end this terrible drought. For the ground had dried and cracked, the grass had withered and died. There were no leaves on the trees nor the bushes, and certainly no fruit, no berries, so the animals had all gone away, even the jackrabbits. Well, there was no coyote, but he was gaunt and hungry. It had been a hard winter, and many of the people had died. That little girl who had no name stood at the edge of that council circle, and she watched the warriors join the drummers and the dancers. She saw them take their knives made of flint and bone and cut themselves and send up their cries to the Great Spirit as well. Finally, the Great Spirit answered and said what the people must do was offer a sacrifice. It was to be a sacrifice of their most prized possession. It was to be a burnt offering, and they were to take the ashes from that offering and scatter them to the four corners of the world, to the north, the south, the east, the west. And only then would the drought be broken. When people talked among themselves, first of all, they didn't know what was their most prized possession, and even if they did, could they be unselfish enough to give it up? They continued to talk among themselves as they went back to their own teepees, and finally the only one left at that council circle was that little girl who had no name. But she knew. She knew what was the most prized possession among the people, and she held it in her arms. It was a doll. A doll made in the form of a warrior clad in buckskin, decorated with bits of bone and colored seeds. Its eyes, its nose, its mouth were painted on with the juice from berries. And on its head were feathers, bright blue feathers from that bird that calls Jay, Jay, Jay. And that little girl loved that doll as much as any Comanche mother ever loved her child. So she knew it must be the most prized possession among her people, and she knew what she must do. First, she went back to her own teepee. She lay down on her buffalo robe, and she listened to the night sounds, to the footfall of the dog, to that last long wail of the coyote, to the cries of the night birds, and finally, to the deep and even breathing of her mother and her father and her brothers and her sisters, and she knew it was time. So she got up off her buffalo robe, still holding her doll closely to her. She reached over into her own teepee fire, and she pulled out the one stick that still had an ember glowing in its end, and she stepped out into the night. And there was no moon that night, but there was enough starlight that she could see to gather sticks and twigs and take them to the edge of that council circle and start a small fire. She watched as the flames began to catch and grow, and as they did, she offered up her own plea to the Great Spirit, saying that she hoped her offering was a worthy one, and that if it was, she would like to have some sign that it was so. She watched as the flames continued to grow, and finally, with tears in her eyes but resolution in her heart, she thrust that doll head first into the flames. And at first she stepped back, for what she smelled was burning feathers and scorching buckskin. She watched as the flames consumed her doll, and finally there was nothing left but just the ashes. And as soon as those ashes cooled, she reached down with both hands and she began to scatter those ashes to the four corners of the world, to the north, the south, the east, the west. And then she was so exhausted that she simply lay down right where she was and fell asleep. She awakened before first light, and she reached her hand out along the ground, and what she felt was not ashes. No, it was something soft as the feathers on the head of her doll. And what she smelled was not that acrid odor of burning feathers and scorching buckskin. No, it was something sweet, something fragrant. She got up, ran back to her own teepee. She got her mother, and together, hand in hand, they walked back toward that council circle just as the sun was coming up. And what they saw before them was a sea of blue. For everywhere that little girl had scattered those ashes, there were now flowers. Bright blue flowers. As blue as the feathers on that bird that calls, Jay! 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 And the little girl told her mother about her sacrifice, and her mother told the father, and the father told the men of the council, and soon everyone had come out to see this sign. And then it began to rain. A soft, gentle, refreshing rain that began to close up those cracks in the ground, and soon the grass began to come back and green up, and the leaves began to appear on the trees and the bushes, and soon there would be fruit and berries, and so the animals all came back. And the warriors had something to hunt again, and the people had food. And that is when the little girl got her name. From that day forward, she was called She Who Loves Her People. And every year, that same flower comes back, especially in central Texas. It covers the roadsides and the hillsides and the lakesides, and we call it the bluebonnet. It is our state flower. It is a harbinger of spring, but when you know this story, it is also a reminder of love and sacrifice, two things that are valued in every culture.
Wow.